I hated reading. I hate reading. I really hate reading. I
Mm.
can't. It's just that my mind starts to wander too much, and I just sort of like, I can give you about a good solid 20 minutes of me with a novel, and then I'm like, I really wonder what puce looks like as a color. I love the act of it, of sitting down. Maybe I got my coffee. Maybe I got my, like, whatever I'm drinking. I think one of the reasons that I really didn't get into it or say that I hated reading was because it was always structured reading from the schools. Like, you got to read this. You need to read 200 pages of this. And I just have sort of realized it wasn't that I really actually hate reading. It's just that I don't like reading the stuff I don't like to read.
Yeah.
And I'm a huge, huge fan of spaceships and lasers, and you don't get a lot of that in high school and in college. So,
Yeah.
So yeah, but I mean, so I was in high school and I really wasn't reading as much as I should. And it showed because, I had to have assignments done and things like that. And my teacher for that AP class, Mr. DeCamp, one of my favorite teachers of all time, he finally pulled me aside at the end of it because he knew I was writing and I was interested in writing. And he's like, look, man, you got to read more. He was also like the Vietnam vet who smoked a lot of weed and wrote a lot of poetry. That guy, he was really super cool teacher. He was like, you got to read. You got to read more. You can't, you have to fill up the tank every time. You can't just sit there and just think that you're going to write everything. And I was like, oh yeah, so sorry. Cause of course at the time I was probably like, I'm so sorry I didn't do the assignment. And cause I was a huge knucklehead. And finally, years later, I started to realize that, yeah, if there's a certain kind of writing that I would like to do, I love being inspired by writers who are doing the things that I want to do. And so that's the first thing that pops into my head when it comes to advice.
I have a similar experience with being compelled to read things that are assigned to you in school. I had a similar response. I didn't enjoy that. And maybe it's a foolish act of self-destructive rebellion. Who knows what it is, right? But I would also read voraciously, but I would make sure to only read the things that I wanted to read. So it was almost like an act of defiance where I'm like, well, I don't want to read these 5 books that have been assigned, but I'll go read these other 10 that I want to read. And so I read a lot as a kid, but just never the stuff to the point where, and I probably shouldn't tell this story, but I think I'm going to anyway.
Ooh.
Yeah. I actually wrote a paper in graduate school on a Leslie Marmon Silko book. I can't remember what it was called. It's the one she's most famous for. Of course, I can't remember the name because I didn't read it. And I was in a Native American lit class, and the professor was a visiting professor from, I think, the University of Nebraska, a really well-read scholar, an older gentleman who lived this stuff. I think he used to live in Taos, New Mexico or something. But anyway, the point of this was that he assigns this thing, and this is like an expert. So I'm writing a paper for an expert, and I haven't read the book. So I decide, okay, well, I'm not going to read this thing because I don't want to, even though it's pretty slim and it's not written poorly, it's a perfectly fine book. Just go read it. But for some reason, I didn't want to do it. So instead, I went to the library and I got 4 or 5 articles that were critiquing the book. And through context clues, I discovered what the through line for the book was. And I did not plagiarize any of those, but by reading their critical take, I'm like, oh, well, this is probably what she was doing. This, and this. So I'll just write it on that. Whatever. So I write it on that, and I have the book, so I can flip to certain pages and kind of skim, just read the first sentence of each paragraph and find the spot in the book where I know something important happens, and I'll read that page and then kind of quote from, the important parts. So I get away with writing this paper. Oh, by the way, I did this the day it was due. So I started at 1 a.m. and kind of wrote through it. It was like a 6:30 class or something. Anyway, I turned this thing in. Of course, I'm like, this has to be the world's crappiest paper. It has to be. So the gentleman, the professor, pulls me aside afterwards. I get an A on it. And he says, this was one of the best papers I've ever read, and you really should look at getting this published. And I'm like, what? What? And I said, oh, no, sir, I really can't do that. And he's like, no, it was really great. It was well thought out and well. And I'm like, no, sir, I can't do that. And so I did not pursue that. But it was very flattering of him. Look, that is not the norm. Normally those things are going to turn out a lot worse. But it really shook my understanding of literary critique, because if I can critique a book successfully without reading it, what does that say about critique?
Right. Yeah.
But I think it was also a very straightforward book, and it played with a lot of the same tropes that we had been dealing with all year. So I was probably prepared to do that. I'm sure that if I just tried to do that today, I would not be very successful, right? Because I was steeped in what was going on. But yeah, I mean, I even, that book was part of a syllabus that I was instructional assistant at Texas State, and that book was on the syllabus for one of the lecture classes that I was assisting with. And I used to do office hours, and the kids were struggling. And I said, okay, well, I'll hold a study session. Anybody who wants to come can come to the study session. I thought I'd get maybe 5 or 10 people. And I got like 40. And then the next study session, I got damn near the whole class to come. This is really impressive, except you have to remember, I haven't read the book. So I've created a circumstance where I'm exposing my lack of knowledge, to the point where one of the guys in the front of the class raised his hand and said in front of 100 college students, have you even read this book? Like, it was not good. And I said, of course I've read, of course I've read it. Anyway, the whole point of this was, yes, I've gone to outstanding lengths to not read a book that's been assigned. And, right. But the beauty of the end of my degree, they said, pick 20 novels, and that's the core reading. And then I had to do the thesis and defend it orally. And I'm like, I get to pick the books? And they're like, yeah, whatever. Just, run it by us first. But yeah, pick 20 books. And I'm like, yay. So I picked a bunch of stuff I had already read that I loved, but I picked another 10 or 12 that were things that I thought you needed to read. And one of them was Madame Bovary. That's one that I had avoided like the plague for most of my career. And I finally decided, I can't really get a master's degree without having at least cracked this sucker open. And I started reading the first 2 pages of it, and it is an amazing book. And I just flew through it. And I'm like, why have I avoided this book for so long? It's amazing. And I think I should probably go back and read it. It's been decades since I've read it, but I just remember being transported by this, really old book at that point. Yeah. Older now. But no, I remembered the thing you had asked earlier, about the bad advice, where that came from. I remember what I wanted to share with you. So it was actually a guy who started teaching at Texas State in my last year there. Again, I'm not going to use names. That's pointless. But he was a very famous and successful short story writer. And I had never met him before, and he was just kind of starting out. I think this was one of his first collegiate teaching gigs. Maybe it was his second, but he was pretty new in his teaching career, but he'd been writing short stories for quite a while. And he was very affable and very personable and engaging and just a cool dude. And I remember asking him if he would be my thesis advisor, and he said no, because he didn't really understand that was part of his, the scope of his job. He thought he was just there to kind of, cruise through and teach. Right. So I was dejected and despondent. And as a result, I didn't consider his advice very favorably, but he had this saying where he would say, man, just tell me a story. And I always thought, and we used to make fun of that to a point, because it's just the worst advice you can give a person. Like, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to tell a story, and I'm asking you how to do that. It's almost like saying, I want to throw a football better. How do I throw a football better? Man, just throw the football. Like, okay. But what he meant, and I'm going to say that this is the worst advice I've ever gotten and also the best advice I've ever gotten, because I think what he meant was, man, don't try to complicate the activity by infusing theme and thinking about all these academic things that you're trying to do. Like, just the way that you would sit down at a bar and kind of tell the story to someone else. Hey, man, did you hear what happened? This. That's what he meant. He's just like, just be direct and tell an interesting anecdote first, you know? And
Yeah.
I think if he had said it that way, I would have accepted it more, but he seemed very kind of flippant or, but he was a very informal person, when it came right down to it. So I would consider that the worst and maybe the best advice I've received in one sentence.
Well, it's funny if I can piggyback off of that, because that sort of just tell me a story it kind of reminds me of something that I sort of fell into, having a background in acting, where that whole idea of just telling an anecdote, don't try and overcomplicate things. One of the biggest things that I've sort of come upon, and it's possible that someone told me this and I just forgot who it was, but just reading the story aloud that I'm working on has helped me so much, because it really does help me kind of structure things well, that's a weird sentence, or wait, why am I saying it this way? Especially because and again, very easy for me because I usually work on smaller pieces up to maybe 1,000 or even 5,000 words. It's very easy to do that in one sitting. It's much more difficult to do it with a full length, like a novel or something like that. But reading passages aloud it sort of, for me, is just trying to tell an anecdote, just trying to tell the story. And that really, really helps me a lot. So it's funny that you got that piece of advice, because I would drive myself nuts with that. Just tell me a story. Oh gosh, okay, yeah, aren't I doing that?
Well, to your credit, that's one of the strengths of your work, is the conversational style. It's very approachable, and the first-person narrators are immediately engaging, and usually the verbiage you're using roots the story in a point of view and usually a time that's easy to identify. So, it's almost like this person's almost pulling you in, psst, hey, listen to this. And you kind of lean, how you want to lean in. That's the way I always feel when I read your work, is I'm kind of leaning in going, oh yeah, what's going on? So that's, so it shows, the fact that you're really thoughtful about how you sound out, that you've got a good ear. That makes total sense. Yeah.
Art, did you even read my story?
I've read one. No.
It always has to be the person at the front of the class, right? That's excuse me. Anywho, there's another piece of advice. The other one that I have, maybe I have three, because I can think of something after this, but one of the, maybe about 20 years ago, I'm not really sure when I did it, but I read Stephen King's On Writing without having read anything else he had ever written in his life. And it's weird because I'm not a huge horror novel person. I'm not a huge horror movie person. And that was at a time I was like, well, Stephen King's very popular. I want to be a writer, so maybe I should just read how to write. And it's a very small piece of advice. And Stephen King in that book says, just say they said. Don't say they intoned majestically, or they parchedly, crumbled their voice. They're trying to add so many adjectives into it. So now whenever I do things, I'm just like, hello there, he said. Mm-hmm. What are you saying? She said. Yeah. That's a small technical piece that I've gotten from Stephen King that I've stuck to, because I realized before that piece of advice, I was simply trying to really come up with, I was trying real hard, man. I was trying to make it so flowery and beautiful, and it was just coming off stupid.
Yeah, because it's that's a really good example of how you can use simple language to help the reader recognize where they should be putting their attention. And it's almost like having amazing crown molding on an outhouse, it's pretty, but it's out of place. It doesn't really help the activity. So it's just, one of those things. I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a couple of books that I return to pretty frequently that have been, seminal in my understanding of writing. One of them is by John Gardner. Do you remember John Gardner? He wrote Grendel.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. He has a book, I think it's called The Art of Fiction, because I haven't read it in probably 2 decades, but I used to come back to it every couple of years, and I would just pour through this thing. He had some writing exercises, but for the most part, it was just his theory and philosophy on writing. And the thing that I remember most vividly from it is this concept he had about the continuous fictive dream. And that's his phrase for how that flow state can occur, where a person really forgets their own surroundings, forgets that they're reading a book, and they're transported into that world that you've created, and they're sort of inhabiting it, in this trance-like state. And I really like that continuous fictive dream, so I've kind of carried that forward in my understanding of how this works. And so my goal is really to not break that flow state, is to not pull them out of the continuous fictive dream. And one of the ways you can do that is with flowery language that reminds people that they're actually reading, So it's really good advice from a number of different people. Are there any other books that you kind of return to again and again, like books on craft?
Man, I gotta, here's the thing, man. I really seriously was I was a jerk. And I sort of was like, I shouldn't be reading books on how to write. This is part of the, we've talked about it before, how I graduated with a degree and I put myself into this mindset of oh my gosh, now I have a degree. I have to prove that I'm a good writer. And so I really stifled myself because I didn't really seek out any books on writing. I didn't really seek out advice. I was like, I have to do it on my own. I have to do it on my own, or I'm not legitimized with, or my degree isn't legitimized. So I really put myself into a really silly mental state of not seeing other people's ways of how they write. There is another book that I have, a book a friend of mine gave me once, and the only advice that came out of that was just to do 15 minutes of stream of conscious writing every day, to try and shake up, just write foolishness just to kind of get into your subconscious. So I don't have any books that I return to. I'm always I read Stephen King's On Writing 20 years ago. The only other thing that I always go back to as far as writing is concerned is, it kind of goes along with that idea that Mr. DeCamp in my high school English class had taught me about reading more, is to just absorb as much stuff as you can. This comes from, I learned narrative improvisational theater from Dad's Garage Theater Company in Atlanta, Georgia. And they were very much, very, very quickly, the way that I gleaned from their teachings, there are kind of two different types of improv theater. One is the sort of gag improv where, you go and everybody's having a really grand old time and they're laughing, and someone else is someone's arms and they make them drink water and it goes down on all the front. The stuff like Whose Line Is It Anyway?
Exactly.
Very, very funny, very, very funny, and done by very, very skilled artists. And what Dad's kind of also did was teach narrative improv theater, which was more story-based improvisational theater, and based in Keith Johnstone's teachings out of a book called Impro. To be able to be comfortable on stage and contribute to the other people's stories on stage, absorb it all. Absorb all of the stories. I know that there's the famous 7. Joseph Campbell, is that him? The 7. What is it? The hero's journey or whatever. Boy.
Yeah, I think it's the 7 plot arcs. I want to say, or 7 types of stories.
And so it's just get all of the movies, get all of the TV shows, get all of the commercials, get all of the, the reading done, get all of the plots, so that you can essentially, when you're on stage, steal from it all and continue a story that will have a basic platform, tilt, and resolution, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that is something that I always come back to when I'm writing, is the idea of I'm working on this piece. What could happen next? Obviously with improv, there's always the generic yes and rule, and that has helped out a lot as well. But that sort of idea of seeing as much pop culture, as much literature, as much everything that you can, it just feeds the beast, so that when you're ready to write, you are armed with so many possibilities. From so many disparate sources.
That's really cool. I appreciate how you bring improv into the writing experience because, gosh, isn't that all it is? Like you sit down and you start writing, you have an empty page or an empty computer screen in my case, and you have to, by yourself improvise the whole damn thing. So
Yeah.
I think that's a really good skill set to have. I recently had the chance to do some improv. It was work related. Believe it or not, it was a team building exercise and I was incredibly uncomfortable doing it. It is not fun for me. I do not like improv, but I got some laughs, so that was good. But no, I'm terrible at it.
Well, that's what's really, really great about it. And I got to be honest with you. You want to make the money? I tell you what, I would love to see how much that person that taught you those improv games got taught because corporate improv gigs, that is money. Anyway,
all right.
But the really great thing about narrative improv is not that you're trying to be funny, not that you're trying to be clever, not that you're really trying to work for laughs. It's to be as boring and obvious as possible because humor comes from the sort of truth of a moment. Mm-hmm. And I'd really like you to not tell any of my acting friends that I finally said the truth of the moment because I can't stand those actors that are like, I just deliver the truth on stage. Man, shut the fuck up. You're making $900 like me. Shut up. But I mean, so it really is. And I know that stifles a lot of people. They're like, I can't do improv because I'm not funny and I'm not clever enough. That's not it. You got to find the classes that really push that sort of be boring and be obvious, just saying the first thing off the top of your head, like just starting a scene, for example. If you're on stage and the lights come up, you suddenly have to begin. And there have been so many times that I have had a blank page and I just sort of like, bam, right into it and run and go there. Because, kind of along those lines, I got the chance a long time ago to interview my favorite guitar player in the world, the Grammy Award-winning artist Vernon Reid from the band Living Colour.
Of course.
From the Grammy Award-winning band Living Colour, I should say. And he is a masterful improviser on guitar. And he once said, improv is like you see an alley. It's an alleyway, and it's pretty dark and nasty. And you just charge headfirst down that alley, even though that you see that there's a dead end, because it's not until you get to the end of that alley that you see, oh, there's another way out to the left, or there's another way out to the right, or there are other possibilities to continue that journey. And I think that is what's really helped me as far as writing. It's like not trying to be clever and not trying to be, like, oh, I'm going to do this thing. Because if anybody knows, Art, that back in college, I was like, I've got this great idea. It's going to be wonderful. And then I just had these ideas that just didn't really work out because they were too much of a gimmick as opposed to a good story.
Yeah.
And so I think that to take that teaching of improv of being boring and obvious and just hitting the page running and just starting to write, it's really helped me a lot.
Yeah, that's great advice. I'm going to try to use that as much as I can because there's nothing scarier, honestly, than sitting down and going, now what? And I used to feel like I had to have that spark of inspiration. Remember the muse? I had to have that kind of show up before I could start. And that limited my opportunities to create because if I'm waiting around for some other thing to kind of kick me into gear, then I've kind of given my agency away. And really, you should approach it kind of workman-like style. It's a job. You got to work. And that's why I think we've talked about this a lot over the last 20, 30 years is how do you get yourself to sort of stick to a schedule and kind of do that. I remember though, if I could pivot just a little bit, I remember when I was thinking about books that influenced me, I liked literary criticism a lot, like more than probably you should. I actually preferred it, to reading the works sometimes because I really liked how people would pick things apart and kind of explain how it worked. A.C. Bradley is a guy I stumbled upon, I think, early in my college career. He was a guy who wrote in the early 1900s about Shakespeare and the form and function of the tragedies. And he just laid it out. It's almost like a dissection in medical school. And it's like, well, here's the liver, here's the kidney. And he cut them open and just showed how they work. And it was, to me, a transformative thing because I didn't understand how the 5X structure worked. I didn't understand what was happening. And after reading Bradley, I felt like I had a better understanding of how to put a story together. So much so that I actually wanted to write a pastiche of a Shakespearean play. And I pitched it to a friend of mine. And I'm like, yeah, I've already got this idea, this pirate and this and that. And he's like, why would you do this? Like, iambic pentameter? Like, why are you going to do this? And so I didn't do it, but I had already kind of mapped out what I wanted to do. It was so transformative. But the thing that got me off of literary criticism was actually Susan Sontag, and that's one of the books that I would go back to, Against Interpretation. I think it came out in '66. It's a collection of essays that she published, and one of them was on style, which was a very well-regarded essay. But she actually, even back then, was sort of saying things that I started to believe after she presented it that way. And of course I'm experiencing it, almost 25 years after she put it down on paper. But basically she's like, literary criticism is killing art. It's killing it. It's killing it. Like she would say, God, what were the words she used? Words like excavate and destroy. Basically, like if you go in and do this thing that I just described, I was so excited about that Bradley had done, that you're actually just destroying the artwork. Rather than, and I guess that comes from, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I think the way I'm remembering it is that you want to experience art, not dissect it. And so that kind of got me off of literary critique, but I still enjoy it. In fact, I just published a piece earlier this month in Meeple Mountain. I write for Meeple Mountain on occasion. It's a board game website, and they publish reviews and critiques and things of that nature. So I've been a staff writer there for over 4 years now. And yeah, there's a book coming out about board game design and development that attacks it like an academic work. It feels like those literary critique books that I used to study in college, and it's about board games. Every aspect of how to create, the materialistic nature of it, etc. And it's quite dense. I mean, it's like 288 pages of really well-researched information. So I wrote a paper on it. I felt like I was back in college. It was fun. I'm like picking this thing apart. So I don't know. I guess I haven't kicked that habit, but that would really impede my writing. The whole reason I brought this up is that notion would impede my writing because I enjoyed editing more than I enjoyed writing. Yeah. And I think that's why I dove head first into trying to assist my classmates with zero tact. And it was not received very well, but I was trying to help because that was the part of the puzzle that I enjoyed more. I really saw myself after getting the degree as kind of going into that editorial track. Yeah. And when I was at Columbia College Chicago, I had been fortunate enough to get an internship at a book publisher, Academy of Chicago Publishers, I think it was. I'd have to look them up, but it was a small book publisher in Chicago. I'd take the L and go into work, and I felt like Bartleby the Scrivener, man. It was awesome. It was so cool to work there. And I'm like, yeah, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to help people publish their work. And that was kind of where I was coming at it from. But now that we're talking about things, I really want to look at it more from the creative aspect and not pick things apart. And I've even kind of brought that sensibility into the work that I'm writing, because I've got another article that I'm working on. There's a Kickstarter preview coming out of a tennis game, and some of what they do is good, but a lot of it is kind of missing the mark. And I asked my editor, so what's the tone here? Cause like, this is what I'm seeing, and it's okay, but not great. But I know that they're trying to get it funded, but I'm not going to lie. So like, what do you want me to do? And he's, he is a really good editor. And he's like, well, you have to judge it based on what it is there. But remember, because you're a board game designer, if you put in stuff that's like, I would have done this, that's out of bounds. And I'm like, cool, right. I know exactly how to attack this now. So I appreciate having a good editor. But, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've appreciated having a good editor. And that's been you for like over 30 years. I mean, being able to, what is that? I was thinking about this the other day. There's an old, I think it's a Taoist story. I'm not sure, but there was this musician and he would play and then he had like one fan. Boy, I am really going to chop this ancient story up. It's going to have Laszlo from What We Do in the Shadows in it by the end of it. But like, a musician, and there was he had a friend who listened and loved the music, and it was amazing, and he really understood the musician. And this friend passed away, and the musician destroyed his instruments. He was like, I don't have anybody that understands my music anymore. What's the point? And I kind of feel like I've been very, very lucky to have you, because that sort of editor thing has really helped me out a lot over the years, and saying like, Tim, you're doing the gimmick thing again.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to, it's always good to have someone that whose advice you really respect and who understands what you're trying to do. Because I think one of the other things that's always, everyone that's ever written has had the problem of giving their piece to someone who's like, you give it to mom, and mom's like, oh, that was very nice, because they're a parent and they love you. And, you find that one person whose advice you really respect, who can say things like, you're doing the gimmick again.
I'll tell you, that comes from my family.
Yeah.
To their credit, I have a fun story about my mom that I'll tell you in a sec, but my grandmother used to beat the heck out of me in cards. Like, she was just a shark. And she taught me how to play gin rummy, but she would never let me win. And my great-grandfather taught me how to play checkers, but he would never let me win. And I think I only took one, maybe two games off of him his entire life, and we played a lot. And I remember telling my grandmother, she had just whooped my butt in rummy. And I said, Granny, why don't you let me win one of these? And she looked at me horrified and she said, play better. It was just like, man up, kid. You gotta. And what I meant was, can you teach me how to play this game so that I have a chance to win?
Right.
But I didn't ask that. I said, can you let me win? Which really wasn't what I meant. But she was right. Like, you got to play better.
And what part of New Orleans or Louisiana was she from?
She lived most of her life in Kenner.
Okay.
But she lived she was born in New Orleans, I believe, and lived in Metairie, Kenner.
I have such fond memories of the 5 years in the 90s I spent in New Orleans, but you did that accent for your grandma, and I knew exactly which part of New Orleans she was from.
She was a hoot, man. She was good people. No, but you mentioned your mother. My mother actually gave me really good critical feedback, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
It was when we were at UNO, and I had this story that was in a workshop. I think you and I were in the workshop together, and I had this story that really, if you imagine an hourglass, and all of the words at the top of the hourglass are flowing down to the bottom, and right at that choke point in the middle is one phrase and really one word that if you don't get it and get the significance of it, the rest of the story doesn't make as much sense. Kids, I don't recommend that you organize your stories this way, right? Because if the person misses the one word in the middle of the whole piece and the rest of it doesn't work, then that's a problem. And that's the feedback that my mother gave me. The word was denim. And so this whole thing occurs, and the fact that I didn't even remember what it was, but the fact that it was denim informed the rest of the story, and you could kind of piece together this puzzle, because back then I was really excited about creating works of art that were challenging to interpret, that really tested your ability to figure them out, because the idea was, the incorrect idea, the terrible idea, the horrible, no good, very bad idea, was that if you gave people a puzzle that they would work at it, solve it, and they would feel good about solving it. Nope. Yeah. That is not a thing. Okay. So if anybody's out there doing that, like, I can't wait to put my puzzles together, please don't do that. I've moved my puzzle making into board game design and board game development. That is where puzzles belong. And so I've scratched that itch. I'm doing that in the right spot now. Right. But she read the story. It was a very short story. It was only 2,000 words, 2,500 maybe. And at the end, she's like, that's nice. But, she had that look. And I knew that there was thought
Yeah.
behind it. I'm like, well, no, really, tell me what you really think. And she's like, you really want to know? I said, yeah. She's like, I don't understand. And so she showed me where she didn't understand. I'm like, well, right here where it says denim, right here. And she's like, Art, if I have to know this one word and see the significance of one word in the entire piece, that's not, fair to the reader. And I'm like, damn
Yeah.
it, she's right. Damn it. She was, so my family has been instrumental in helping to shape my worldview, and I've been fortunate enough to have direct and honest feedback throughout my life. So
That's great.
yeah.
Yes. And I have too, because I know you and you do that for me.
Well, you're like family.
You're passing it on. Yeah.
That's right. The other book I wanted to mention was a book of Hemingway quotes. I don't remember the name of it, but it's, I think it's The Art of Writing. But it's just a collection of quotes that Hemingway had. And I don't remember any of them off the top of my head, but I wanted to mention it because if you're ever, curious or interested in finding it, I'm sure it's at Barnes and Noble or wherever. And it's very thin, but each quote has this sort of significance that it's imbued with because it's Hemingway, and obviously it's very terse and to the point.
Yeah.
But they're just very buck up and do it. It's really a kick in the pants. Like each one of them is like, what are you complaining about? Go write. You have arms, you have a pen, go write. It's basically just.
I really would love to see Hemingway's TikTok if he could have had one. Oh man, he'd just be yelling at you. You there? What are you doing? Go right.
I took a Hemingway class in graduate school, and the guy was the professor was a huge Hemingway fan. Obviously, if he's going to teach a graduate level course on it, but he said that one of the things that he always imagined Hemingway would do is if like the sensibility of everything that he was about could be summed up in one phrase, which is "damn fine lion." Like he shoots this thing. He's like, damn fine lion. I'm like, that's pretty direct.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That is my favorite. Hemingway. Anyway, the short, happy life of Francis Maycomb.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then what if you were to summarize then, what good comes from advice? And should you be taking it? Or where should you be taking it from?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that the trustworthiness of the advice comes from the sincerity of the advice. So if you've got someone who clearly doesn't have your best interest in mind, someone who's more interested in themselves rather than in you, that's probably advice you should catalog and review at a later, much, much later time, if ever. And I had that in school. There were a couple of people who I knew didn't like me. Whether it was justified or not is irrelevant, but I knew they didn't like me, or they did not like my approach to writing. So I would always take their advice, but I would take it and put it in the back of the closet because it just wasn't helpful. And I mean, maybe they were trying to be helpful, but it didn't come off that way. It really came off as condescending. I learned the word problematic by receiving quite a bit of feedback.
Right.
That gentleman is a friend of mine, but he taught me the word problematic. I'd never heard that before, and it was, of course, in response to my work. He wasn't wrong. I mean, he wasn't. But I think so. If you recognize that someone is trying to chip away at your determination or your ego, or your capability, if they're trying to cut you down, please don't pay them any mind.
Yeah.
Even if they're correct in what they're saying, the attitude or the intent is negative, and you really shouldn't internalize that, is my point of view. So seek out those people who are positive. But again, you can't just go, like you had mentioned earlier, to someone who is nice for the sake of being nice. Maybe a relative who's like, this is great, you should publish it. Well, what do you like about it? I don't know, the whole thing. It was all great. You know what I mean? That doesn't help either. So what you're really looking for is people who have the vocabulary to speak critically about the work, but do so in a constructive manner. And that's a very narrow pool of people.
Yeah, it's tough to find, but because it's very tough to say this is the thing that I want to write. I know what I want to write, and find people that can give kind of give you advice that sort of leads you to that end. Because I mean, I've been in a lot of talkbacks for a lot of plays in my acting career where they open it up for questions from the audience. and you see a poor playwright who has spent years, maybe months, maybe years, maybe decades writing this play that has finally made it on stage, and you'll get someone that's just like, I don't like it when he said that they should take the car ride to the mall. It's like, oh God. So, I mean, advice comes in all forms, but I think it's really important to try and remember what it is that you're trying to set out to say and find folks who understand that and are trying to help you reach that goal.
Yeah. And, reaching out to the target audience can be helpful as well. So if you know that it's not somebody who knows much about the craft of writing, but they are a voracious reader and they have a library that impresses you, let's say that, then putting it in front of them just to get that kind of reader's perspective can be super duper helpful as well. Yeah. So all of the above, but here's the challenge, right? So the artist is inherently both fiercely independent and absolutely codependent on the reader's approval. So making that work is a daily struggle. So you can swing that pendulum too far in either way. And I've been on either side of that spectrum where it's like, damn it, they don't understand my genius. I'm not changing a word. I think I've heard you say that, jokingly, in our conversations. And then on the other side, it's like one person says, well, I don't like the word square. Like, I'll make it rectangle. That'll fix it. And like, no. Yeah. So that truth that you were talking about earlier, that vision that you're trying to accomplish, as artists, the artist has to be true to the vision. And even if the population at large doesn't like that vision or doesn't want to participate in that vision, if it's the artist's calling, they should do it. How many people have written or painted or sculpted and have been complete failures within their lifetime, but have been recognized as geniuses after their death? People change, culture changes. And so I think it's really good advice to just go forth with what you find compelling, do it the best you can, and don't worry about what's popular now. I've heard this a lot too. And so if you're trying to write a bestseller for what's hot now, it won't get produced now. And by the time you actually write it, get it through the editing process, maybe get it published, what's popular now will probably be passé. And so it'll be out of step with what's happening now. The only way to be a leader and the only way to be relevant is to write what's important to you, in total, and wait for society to catch that wave and ride it with you to the shore. That's the only way to do it. Yeah.
And hopefully it'll happen before you die.
Yeah, or not, it doesn't, it shouldn't matter, honestly.
I guess that's true, yeah.
We're not here trying to, coach people on how to write bestsellers. We're just talking about, why are we doing this in the first place? And I just want something that I can be proud of. And I think a lot about whatever I put my name on, I want to be proud of, and I want my kids to be able to read it and be proud of it as well.
Yes.
So, and not from a dirty or clean perspective, but just from an artistic standpoint, if it's something that kind of stands the test of time or catches a wave later down the road, it would be nice for me to have put the proper amount of work and thought into it.
Yeah, yeah.